Hi, everybody. This is my reaction to my first time reading through Austen's well-known and beloved classic, Pride and Prejudice. While I'm familiar with the characters and the general plotline due to references to them and their influence on other works, I haven't seen any of the film adaptations either. This video covers Volume 2, Chapters 11 through 15. An attempt at a quick recap. The Bennet family is the parents and 5 daughters who are either old enough to marry or very close to it. Things are complicated because the family home is entailed, which means it has to pass to the nearest male relative. This happens to be a distant cousin, Mr. Collins. He proposes to the next eldest daughter, Elizabeth, because Jane, the oldest, seems to have formed an attachment with Mr. Bingley, a suitable, in other words, wealthy and charming, young man who lives nearby. Elizabeth turns Mr. Collins down because she doesn't like him, and he proposes to her friend Charlotte Lucas, who accepts. Complications arise when Mr. Bingley leaves for London without plans to return, and worse, never comes to see Jane when she goes to visit her aunt and uncle in London. Jane, in addition to being beautiful and accomplished, is also a paragon of everything that is good. Despite her heartbreak, she refuses to believe that anyone could ever do anything unkind to anyone else, and is sure that it's all just a big mistake. Elizabeth goes to visit her friend Charlotte now that she is living with her husband at his parish, about 50 miles away. Charlotte's sister and father are part of their group, although her father can only stay for a week or so, instead of the month and a half that the others are apparently expected to. While they're visiting, Mr. Collins's patron, Lady Catherine, is visited by Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy, who is a friend of Mr. Bingley's who is even wealthier, but, alas, far less charming, and Elizabeth doesn't like him either. She attempts to avoid him. Chapter 11. Elizabeth does not go to Rosings for tea with Lady Catherine and everybody else because she can't stand the thought of dealing with Mr. Darcy, who's going to be there. Instead, she stays at the parsonage and rereads the letters she's gotten from Jane. Now, of course, St. Jane won't complain, but Elizabeth definitely notices that she doesn't write with, quote, that cheerfulness, which had been used to characterize her style. She's looking forward to Mr. Darcy leaving in a couple of days, and that she and Jane will both be home together in less than 2 weeks. The doorbell rings and she thinks Colonel Fitzwilliam has come to visit, which is kind of flattering since she's the only one there. But instead, it's Mr. Darcy, who, as mentioned previously, is the reason she didn't go with everybody else to tea. And then he proceeds to make an already unpleasant experience even more so by declaring his deep and impassioned love for her, using every insult the author can come up with. Her personal worthlessness, in comparison to him at least, his apparent shame at being attracted to her despite her shortcomings, of her wretched family and the agony of humiliation that he would have to suffer through if he were connected to them, and in conclusion, how strongly he tried to avoid such an unsuitable attraction before finally succumbing to his baser self and proposing, despite having every reason not to. Elizabeth, having pooh-poohed her friend's warning on this matter, is caught off guard. Yet, she manages to turn him down in a courteous, well-formed paragraph. And then he throws it back at her, tells her she didn't try hard enough to be as polite as he wanted her to be, and says he might want to know why she's rejecting him, but of course he doesn't actually care. Not really. She points out that the abuse he heaped upon her during his proposal was reason enough to be rude back, if she actually was. But she decides not to leave it at that and brings up the whole Jane and Mr. Bingley thing. Surprise, surprise, though, he's perfectly fine with this and even seems proud of destroying any potential of a relationship there. Why Elizabeth doesn't just tell him to get out at that point, I'm not sure. I guess maybe since he shows exactly zero guilt for making St. Jane miserable, she wonders if he has any soul whatsoever. Because next, she brings up Mr. Wickham, and how Mr. Darcy denied him opportunities that he should have had based on childhood jealousy. But Mr. Darcy tells her is that the real reason she's upset with him is because of the insults. Oh, pardon me, the scruples he held that kept him from falling for her earlier. That he could have oh so cleverly fooled her into thinking that he liked her family, but he just has far too much integrity as, quote, disguise of every sort is my abhorrence. And obviously, his flattery would have been so charmingly effective that she would have ignored the pain he'd caused her sister and the cruelty he'd shown to a boyhood friend, because all of that would have been outweighed by his sweet words. First of all, Mr. Can't String a Sentence Together Darcy, that's more than a bit of a stretch. And second, it shows such a high estimation of her character, as gullibility and fickleness are just absolutely the highest and noblest qualities to which womankind can aspire. There are a couple of lines from this scene that stand out and are pretty well known from Mr. Darcy. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections, to congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beneath my own? Yeah, he's a real winner. And from Elizabeth. I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. Both of these lend themselves very well to performance because the manner of their delivery influences what the audience is led to believe about the characters, and there is a bare minimum of narration at this point. Is Mr. Darcy conceited, spiteful, or just actually confused? And Elizabeth, we do know that she is livid at this point, but how much does she rein it in? How much does she show? And how does she show it? In point of fact, she does not throw the crockery, so there is that. Usually in what I've seen from clips or GIF sets or trailers, she kind of spits her lines, but when I'm really steamed up, I get colder. And I could see that, a sort of detachment. I can't imagine wanting to marry you. Of course, you are pathetically wealthy, and the money does help make you at least somewhat less loathsome. And a shrug. But, well, not enough. However, I came up with a few other lines that I think do an even better job of maintaining the veneer of civility. If hating you were a capital offense, I should skip up the stairs to the gallows and blow a kiss to the hangman. And I hope that when you breathe your last, the people nearby are those who truly care about you, so you can see how many of them there actually are. After all, the best ones sound like compliments. Anyway, he finally accepts her rejection, stumbles through some pleasantries? I don't know. Are we supposed to believe he actually means it when he says, accept my best wishes for your health and happiness? Because it doesn't come across that way. It seems highly formulaic, but it's just the dialogue, and there's no action or description there. So we don't really know how he says it, but at any rate, he leaves, thank freaking God. And Elizabeth has been holding in her fury and humiliation for so long that now that she can finally let go of it, she just sits down and bawls her eyes out, quote, for half an hour. The narrator says it was gratifying to have inspired unconsciously so strong an affection. But honestly, no. Inspiring affection in somebody you truly believe to be an awful person is something to be deeply ashamed of. And so, when she hears Lady Catherine's carriage rolling up and realizes that everybody else will be returning from tea, she scuttles off to hide in her room, alone. Chapter 12. The next day, Elizabeth is still all muddled up about Mr. Darcy's intrusion and that miserable, obnoxious proposal. So she goes out for a walk, and finally, she actually has the sense to avoid the park, where she told Mr. Darcy she liked to spend time, and goes in the opposite direction. She eventually doubles back, and at the gate of the park, she looks in and spots a man on the other side. It's too far away to tell who it is, but just in case it's Mr. Darcy, she turns to escape, but unfortunately, not only is it actually Mr. Darcy, he's already seen her, and he calls her name. The only reason that I can think of that she does not simply keep walking in the other direction as quickly as she possibly can is that the plot demands that she meet with him. Because if he's that far off, while it might not technically be the most courteous thing to do to avoid someone who's hollering at you from across the grove, she could easily be like, oh, whoopsie, ha ha ha, you mustn't have been loud enough. Anyway, he shoves a letter at her and says he's been walking around looking for her all morning and asks her to read the letter, though he leaves without bothering to listen to whether she agrees or refuses. Whatever. Nice line. So yeah, she opens it up and it's like pages. And Mr. Darcy really packs it in. Apparently he started at 8 that morning, but it's like a lot. And he said he'd been looking for her for a while. And it's not lunchtime yet, so I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this, but he must have written that sucker really fast. So it's not like he had time to draft any of it. Although I suppose he could have drafted it the previous evening and then just copied it out in the morning. At any rate, he's got to be good at writing because there's no mention of any blotches or misspellings or anything. And pens back then were tricky things, even if you had nice ones, which I'm sure Mr. Darcy did, being filthy rich and all. Let's just say that the dude is not nearly as brief-spoken on paper as he is in person. Good Lord. He has one introductory paragraph, and then he just goes on. Like, seriously, he could put Mr. Collins to shame, except he's not nearly as complimentary. Honestly, this letter was a chore to get through. Blah, frickin' blah, TLDR version. He didn't think Jane was particularly interested in Mr. Bingley. The Bennets have a total want of propriety, quote, that make them objectionable and defective, but hey, she should consider that almost a compliment because despite being surrounded by such miserable people, she and Jane have managed not to be complete losers like the rest of their family. Ugh. He's really, really bad at this whole compliment thing. I don't know. Maybe he could take some lessons from Mr. Collins. So he goes on to admit that yes, he knew that Jane was in London and he deliberately kept that information from Mr. Bingley. Now, what's interesting here is that he says, quote, "Perhaps this concealment, this disguise was beneath me. It is done, however, and it was done for the best." Now, hang on just a quick minute, because I seem to recall something from just a few pages earlier. Yeah. What was that again? Quote, "Disguise of every sort is my abhorrence." Yeah, so he's a hypocrite and a liar. And yet, on the next page, when he accuses Mr. Wickham of vicious propensities and, quote, want of principle without giving any evidence of such, I guess that's just okay. Mr. Darcy then proceeds to write about Mr. Wickham and says that after their fathers died, Mr. Wickham told him that he didn't want the clergy job and asked for a lump sum of money instead, claiming that he was going to study the law. Mr. Darcy didn't really believe he was going to do it, but doesn't think that Wickham would be a good pastor, so he gives Mr. Wickham the money. And then he writes that for Mr. Wickham, quote, "Studying the law was a mere pretense, and being now free from all restraint, his life was a life of idleness and dissipation." There is, of course, no indication of how he knows this. In fact, he even goes on to say, for about 3 years, I heard very little of him. So then, later, the pastoral job that Mr. Wickham was originally promised becomes available. Mr. Wickham asks Mr. Darcy for it, saying that the law was, quote, "a most unprofitable study." I find it difficult to believe that he actually said that he wasted the money Mr. Darcy gave him to help him in that profession. So Mr. Darcy didn't actually have any reason to know that Mr. Wickham squandered the money instead of studying law. And while I don't make a habit of quoting W, this was nothing more than, quote, "the soft bigotry of low expectations." And we're still not done. Next, Mr. Darcy transitions to talking about his sister, Georgiana, who's 10 years younger than he is. He's 26 and she's 16. He and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, were given guardianship of her when Mr. Darcy's father died. Anyway, he says that the previous summer she was taken from school and, quote, "an establishment formed for her in London." I don't know what that means. Anyway, Mr. Wickham shows up where Georgiana Darcy is, and he makes eyes at her, and she is won over completely, and he gets her to agree to elope. But, as it happens, Mr. Darcy comes by to visit her a day or two before they are going to run off and get married, and she tells him about it. In his letter to Elizabeth, he says, and I quote, "You may imagine what I felt and how I acted." Dude probably flipped a table or two. Anyhow, Mr. Darcy promises Elizabeth that everything that he's written in the letter is the truth and encourages her to talk to Colonel Fitzwilliam if her hatred of him makes her unwilling to believe his claims. I mean, aside from the lack of any evidence whatsoever to support them, but, you know, whatever. Chapter 13. So, pretty early, there was a sentence that I didn't really get. With amazement did she first understand that he believed any apology to be in his power. I think that means that she's amazed that he thinks that an apology would matter to her. But, like, did he actually apologize? Like, when he's talking about Jane and he admits to Elizabeth, and he admits that Elizabeth probably knows her better than he does, the closest he gets is to say, quote, "Your resentment has not been unreasonable." But he doesn't actually say that he's sorry that he hurt Jane. And later he admits that he deliberately deceived his close friend and adds that if he hurt Jane, he didn't mean to. He doesn't ever say that anything he did was wrong, or that he shouldn't have done it, or that he's sorry he did it, or, as far as I can tell, express any actual regret whatsoever. There's no apology in that entire letter. I literally went back and checked, and I can't find it, and now I despise him even more. What a pompous, self-righteous jerk. Anyway, the narrative tells us that Elizabeth begins reading with a strong prejudice against anything he might say, quote, "Why? I mean, I guess maybe it isn't meant that she thinks he's going to fib. She just doesn't want to hear from him. I didn't want to hear from him." But she keeps reading, and she's all super flustered. She gets to the bit about Wickham, and there's kind of a, "But he seemed like such a nice guy." And I feel like we're supposed to view this differently from Jane, who doesn't like to think anything unkind about anybody, which isn't totally unreasonable. Elizabeth apparently seems to think that she is a better judge of people's character than Jane is, that she can ferret out the bad ones, like Mr. Darcy. Here's the thing, though. Even if she is wrong about Mr. Wickham, and he actually is a selfish, rotten liar, that doesn't mean she's also wrong about Mr. Darcy, and that he's not a self-important, domineering lout. Like, they can both be jerks. She also remembers some of the things Colonel Fitzwilliam said and how they seem to confirm what Mr. Darcy is saying in this, which is pretty impressive considering how flustered she is. Anyway, she reflects that, quote, she had no reason to question Colonel Fitzwilliam's character. Although, of course, previously she'd had no reason to question Mr. Wickham's character, so I don't know. Maybe she should start questioning people's character a little more. Upon further reflection, she decides that if Mr. Darcy really had done something as horrid as Mr. Wickham says, he couldn't have kept it a secret because it was just so wrong. But here's the thing. Mr. Wickham did something horrid, and he was apparently able to keep that a secret. Yet Elizabeth is abruptly willing to completely reverse her stance on both men, as far as I can tell, and she paces back and forth along the lane and upbraids herself for another 2 hours and then decides that she ought to go back in and fake being pleasant and sociable. Anyway, when she gets back, she finds out that Mr. Darcy came by to see her but left when she wasn't there, and Colonel Fitzwilliam did too, and he stuck around for quite some time and she'd only just missed him. However, quote, she could think only of her letter. Chapter 14. The next day, Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy finally leave Rosings, and Mr. Collins's household is invited over for dinner. Elizabeth amuses herself by thinking about how Lady Catherine would have reacted if Mr. Darcy had presented her as his fiancée. After dinner, Lady Catherine notices that Elizabeth is kind of down, and she assumes it's because she's going to be leaving, so she invites her to stay with Mr. Collins and Charlotte longer. Never mind that she's not actually inviting Elizabeth to stay at her house. It's perfectly okay, because she's Lady Catherine. But Elizabeth manages to stay both polite and unwavering, and eventually we are told that, quote, Lady Catherine seemed resigned. Point to Elizabeth. Lady Catherine insists that they be chaperoned back to their homes as, quote, young women should always be properly guarded and attended, according to their station in life, which is a little ironic, as it sounds like she's the one who arranged for Georgiana to be chaperoned at Ramsgate, which is where Mr. Wickham found her and schmoozed his way into an almost elopement. A bit of amusing commentary during the course of their visit, Lady Catherine asks Elizabeth questions about her trip home. And Elizabeth has to pay attention, quote, as she did not answer all of them herself. It's like this small peach. Anyway, Elizabeth sees this as a good thing because it means she has to pay attention and she can't let her thoughts wander. She has to make sure she's alone when she does this. And when she does, it is, quote, the greatest relief and provides, quote, all the delight of unpleasant recollections. So she's like kind of wallowing in her misery. Good for her. So Elizabeth keeps going over and over the letter, and she decides that her judgment and berating of Mr. Darcy was unfair. Still not sure about that. Apparently, she decided to believe him that now he and Mr. Bingley and Colonel Fitzwilliam are the ones who, quote, seem like such nice guys, and she should believe Mr. Darcy's version of events without actual corroboration. Whatever. Then she starts feeling bad for Mr. Darcy because she hurt his feelings by being honest with him about not wanting to marry him. What? So then she starts thinking about her family and their, quote, unhappy defects. They aren't proper. Their mom has, like, no idea what good manners even are, and their dad isn't enough of a drill sergeant to enforce proper behavior from, quote, Lydia, self-willed and careless, and, quote, Catherine, weak-spirited, irritable? I don't remember that part. Anyway, and completely under Lydia's guidance. Note, no mention whatsoever is made of Mary. I still think Mary is my favorite character out of all this, and she deserved better. Anyway, Elizabeth is also worried about Jane, which, that much is reasonable. Now that she knows that it really wasn't Mr. Bingley's fault that he dropped Jane, but that Mr. Darcy had pushed for it, and that Mr. Bingley really did seem to care deeply about Jane, there is a greater sense of loss. And even though it doesn't say this, I do think she's also wondering about Jane's prospects, based on how much Mr. Darcy despises the rest of the family. If they're so unbearable that Saint frickin' Jane can't make a match with someone who really, really likes her, then what possible chance for happiness does she actually have? Or Elizabeth herself, for that matter. They spend more time at Rosings now that Lady Catherine doesn't have Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam around to needle, because you know she would do that. Including the evening before they finally head home. Lady Catherine is so gracious, condescending, as to wish them a nice trip home and invite them back. Her daughter, quote, exerted herself so far as to curtsy and hold out her hand to both. Poor kid. I like Lady Catherine, and we don't really get to see very much of Miss de Bourgh, her daughter. I'm kind of curious about her. There seems to be some indication that she's not actually terribly ill and it's kind of overplayed, but mostly we just don't get to know her. Chapter 15. Finally, it's time to leave. Mr. Collins and Elizabeth have an early breakfast, and he takes the opportunity to be super extra polite, grateful that she came, etc. It turns out that Elizabeth has enjoyed herself, despite having kind of dreaded the visit, since she didn't like Mr. Collins and didn't really approve of Charlotte marrying him. But she's enjoyed herself so much that she's able to gush about her visit enough to appease Mr. Collins himself. He tells her that he hopes that one day she will marry someone she can be as happy with as he and Charlotte are together. Elizabeth kind of bites her tongue a bit and says she truly believes that he's happy and she's very glad of it. But apparently she's still super judgy of her friend, pities her terribly, and can only imagine the reason she isn't abjectly miserable is that she's still happy with having nice stuff that, quote, her home and her housekeeping, her parish and her poultry, and all their dependent concerns had not yet lost their charms. Okay, so I appreciate the pairing and the alliteration, but really? Apparently Charlotte is greedy and materialistic and likes being in charge of things and bossing folks around. Yay? They're just such good friends. Anyway, Elizabeth and Maria, Charlotte's younger sister, remember, finally get on their way. Maria exclaims, "How much I shall have to tell!" And Elizabeth just kind of smiles to herself and thinks, "How much I shall have to conceal." Yeah, exactly what does she think she needs to conceal, and why? Is she just not going to tell anybody that Mr. Darcy proposed and she turned him down too? Is she not going to investigate his allegations against Mr. Wickham? I can definitely understand her not wanting to just blab that around everywhere without verifying it. They visit the Gardiners in London again, and Elizabeth is reunited with Jane, though she's decided to wait until they get home to tell her about Mr. Darcy. Because reasons? Anyway, she's looking forward to Jane's reaction to that bit of news. Plus, apparently she's hoping to, quote, gratify whatever of her own vanity she had not yet been able to reason away. It seems that Mr. Darcy isn't so awful that she is ashamed that he liked her. That was not as much of an issue as it was with Mr. Collins. However, she's not sure how much she should tell because she isn't certain how Jane will feel if Mr. Bingley's name should happen to come up in the conversation. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you so much for sticking around with me. I am very slowly chugging my way through this book, but I am also reading a number of other books. My Goodreads link is in the description, and I would love to hear your thoughts or recommendations. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye for now.